these were the dominant wind patterns, but there were also micro wind patterns as a result of the fact that these monsoon winds moved in a clockwise direction. So they came down from the northeast, and they moved in a clockwise direction, and turning as it went until it moved back, moved around to the southwest position, and then they moved backward. And so the winds were ideal, mainly because as they moved in a clockwise direction here, they moved into areas where the very important products that were in demand in the East-West trade, such as the cloves, the nutmeg, and the mace from the Spice Islands, the sandalwood from Timor, and a whole lot of sea products. And so the winds were very important because it shortened the travel time for these traders. But another important thing was that as they moved and came to the midpoint of their journey, they could harbor right within the Straits of Malacca, mainly because of the presence of these two mountain chains, one across the spine of the Malay Peninsula and the other across the spine of the island of Sumatra. And what that did was to protect this area here from the brunt of the winds. And so they could harbor along either coast of the Straits of Malacca, which they did. And so if you look at the history of the Malay areas, you find that they were able to arise mainly because of the presence of these ships harboring in the Straits of Malacca where the Malays were settled. And so one of the other interesting points is that as the traders moved here down the Straits of Malacca and turned upward to go to China, they were moving in the waters of the home waters of the Orang Laut. And this was the Negara Selat, the realm of the Straits. And this was something that enabled the Orang Laut to play a much more important role than if they were located somewhere else. So all of these factors were important for the rise in prominence of the Sea Peoples, and the reason why they were so crucial to the Malay entrepôt states, which became an important factor in the trade, international trade. So now that we've kind of seen how the Orang Laut fitted in this whole pattern of trade and why they became prominent, let's look then and see who were the Orang Laut, or who are the Orang Laut. So here is just a generalized picture of the Sea Peoples. And what is interesting is the Orang Laut are just called the Orang Laut the Sea Peoples. I haven't been able to find any evidence of another name that they call themselves. But if you look at the other Sea Peoples, you got three major Sea Peoples. You got in the north, the Moken and the Moklen. The Moklen are those who decide to settle on land, and the Urak Lawoi. The Urak Lawoi is just a dialect for the Orang Laut. So these are groups along the peninsula here. This is the Burmese Peninsula or the Thai Peninsula, and they occupied the seas and the littoral or the coastal areas here. So they were the smallest group, but they're the only ones up in this northern area. Then you get the Sea People, the Orang Laut that I'm talking about today. They were in that Selat, Negara Selat that I've talked about. And here, of course, I'm not sure who made this map, but they omitted some of the very important areas right off the coast of southwest Borneo. And so they were much more extensive than this shows. But this was really the heart of the whole waters of the Orang Laut. Then the third, which is the most extensive of the sea peoples that Noel referred to, was the Samabajau. And these were found in many places. So you get a very strong component in the Philippines, in the southern part of Mindanao, in the Sulu archipelago, and in the northern part of Malaysia, which is now Sabah up here. And then you get them on the eastern coast of Kalimantan, northern coast of Sulawesi, and southeast coast of Sulawesi, and a bit in here. And then the islands in the son of the Java Sea. And then the islands right here, which are basically Sumbawa and some of the islands here, parts of Timor here, Sulawesi here, as well as in the Bird's Head Peninsula. So they're very extended, the sea peoples. But they're not the same people. They're different. They have similarities in lifestyle, but different in composition. Now, one of the interesting things that has happened since I wrote the original draft of this PowerPoint is the appearance of a new book, which some of you may be interested in. It is called Sea Nomads of Southeast Asia, which is a collection that has new theories about who these sea peoples were. And they're written by archaeologists, linguists, anthropologists, and historians. It was published by the NUS Press, and it's just appeared this month. I got an advance copy and was able to use it to mention a bit more about the sea peoples. So this is not only the Orang Laut, but all the sea peoples that we've talked about. And they called it sea nomads rather than sea peoples because of the nomadic lifestyle of these people. So it's a little complex reasoning, but I'll just give you the gist of what they're saying. So what they've done archaeologically is to move back the period when these sea nomads or sea peoples appeared. And it's really a striking thing, because remember that these are archaeologists who are talking about this. And so what they have is material remains. That's all they can go on. And so what they've done is to look at these remains and identify common presence of shared objects, for example, stones or things that were found only in certain areas, or shared technologies and traditions, which could only have been passed on from one area to another. And so by looking at how much of this had spread into areas of Southeast Asia, they then decided that there must have been some kind of a maritime traffic to carry these objects from where they were from originally into these areas. And so this is when they talked about an ancient maritime interaction. And so they went back as 50,000 years. These are archaeologists, of course, 50,000 years before present. So before present is 1950. So this would be almost 50,000 years ago. And so there were already interaction on the sea as a result of the finding of all of these elements. And so from this, they decided that the sea peoples may have been among those who had been carrying some of these things, but they never called them sea peoples. However, they did start to use the sea people, the sea nomads, for the period about the turn of the Common Era, the turn of from CE to from BCE to CE, or from BC to AD, and their argument is that these sea peoples who emerged at about this time did so as a result of new economic opportunities which were arising as a result of trade. And we have, I've already talked about this east-west trade. And it was this east-west trade which began about this time that the sea peoples emerged, which may have been the stimulus for the rise of the Orang Laut, or the sea people. And so what they argue is that these sea people then emerge from the ordinary community, the communities along the coast, the littoral communities. They emerge from them to take advantage of the new economic opportunities. And as a result, they acquired new technologies and skills in order to be able to cater to this east-west trade. So this is a new theory which has just come out, and I'm using this to kind of show you that the sea peoples had a very, very ancient tradition. And even if you look at the sea peoples that we know today, that's still about 2,000 years old. So let's go and then look at the areas where the sea peoples operated and where they emerged as very prominent in the East-West trade. And this was in the Negara Salat, as I pointed out. And this is the realm of straits. These are the home waters of the Orang Laut. And what I did was to kind of look at the oldest Malay document that we have of the Sejarah Melayu. The original name was Sulalatul Salatin. And even though the story of the Sejarah Melayu, or the Sulalatul Salatin, is during the period of the Malacca Kingdom in the 15th century and early 16th century. The earliest recension, the earliest copy that we have is about 1612, after the fall of Malacca. And this was the Raffles manuscript 18. And if you look at the manuscript itself, what is interesting is the use of the word Laut to refer to the areas where the sea peoples were. And so here I just quoted a section from the Sejarah Melayu, where one of the early ancestors of the Malays with the early ancestors of the Malay rulers were talking, and the ruler himself, or this prince from Bukit Seguntang, which is the ancestral mountain of the Malays, talks to the ancestors of the Malays, and he says to him, I want to go to the sea to look for a place where I can create a negri. And so he goes out of Palembang and goes through the various salats of various straits in order to look for a place to build his kingdom. And then you have another reference after the fall of Malacca in 1511, where the Bendahara, now one of the officials of the kingdom, says to his son, go to the sea and gather my people in the sea, and let's go together to get the ruler who was fleeing as a refugee from the Portuguese. And so the son goes, and he goes and gathers the sea peoples. And here in the Sejarah Melayu, they're called Sakai, and they go and they gather them together in order to help the refugee ruler. So in both these both of these references, they're talking about the sea as referring to the waters of the Orang Laut, and this is the reference to the Negara Salat. So here you can see the term Negara Salat that I put here, so that one can have a sense of where the sea peoples were operating from. Here's Singapore, just to get you seeing here, and then Riau and Lingga archipelagos here. So in other sources, what's interesting is that you have, even before the Sejarah Melayu, you have Chinese sources talking about the waters of Loyue, which was a rendezvous for international shipping to and from China. And two early French scholars reconstructed Loyue as Laut. And later on, some of them said, oh, this referred to Johor, but this was still within the areas of the Sea Peoples. And the Arabs, right, of the Salai, from the word Salat, the straits, and they referred to the straits as rich in natural produce and located somewhere on or off the east coast of Sumatra. And as we've seen, this was the areas where the Sea Peoples were located. And from the Dutch archival material from the 18th century, there's a source in 1719 which talks about a Raja Nagara, and was as obvious the Raja Nagara Salat. And he is noted as a leader of the Orang Laut groups based in Singapore and the head of a large numbers of the Sea Peoples or the Orang Laut. And later in the 19th century, you get Sir Stamford Raffles, the Englishman, proclaiming as when they had a thronal dispute after the death of the ruler of Johor, one contender was supported by the Dutch and the other by the British. And the British raised the elder son, Hussein, to be the rightful ruler of Johor in 1819. And the Tufatul Nafis refers to him as the young the Pertuan Salat, again, very much in the tradition of the Nagara Salat. And so one of the things I wanted to emphasize, therefore, is that when you think of the area of the Nagara Salat and you look at it, it seems like it's principally water, and that it couldn't be so very important because it's water and a lot of little islands which don't seem to add up to much. So what I've tried to do is to try to make people think about looking at the sea not as an empty area, but as an area that is full of connectivities, of connections. And this I've gotten from an oceanic scholar, a Pacific Island scholar called Epeli Haofa, who introduced the concept of the Sea of Islands. And this is why it's in the title, and I see that it's part of your exhibit as well. Because what you're talking about in the Sea of Islands is that you're not talking about an empty place, not empty spaces, but of an area that's full of routes that lead to the resources or to family throughout the water, throughout the region where this water space is. And so you get this concept that is carried over in islands in the Pacific. And I've brought this a picture of Hawaii in order for you to kind of see how it actually operates. And so in Hawaii, you have the concept of the ahupua'a, and this concept is still very strong in Hawaii. And now when they're thinking in terms of reapportionment of the seats because of the 10-year census that occurred, many of them are talking about maintaining the ahupua'a as the basis for the new apportionment. But here in the ahupua'a, it's land and sea plus the reefs that are important. So at the very top, you see uka, and uka refers to the mountains. And so as the water comes down from the mountains to the stream, to the river or stream, it flows through the plains, which is here, and then it flows out into the sea, but it doesn't end in the sea. It goes as far as the where the coral reefs are. So this perception of this continuum of the unity of the land and the sea is a very important one in the ideas of the Nagara Salat, and why it is important to understand this when we think about the Orang Laut. And the reason is this, and I've shown you here because this is the Pacific Islands. As you can see, it's a vast area of water, and before people used to refer to it as an enormous empty space scattered with small little unimportant islands. But as we've seen now, these are not unimportant islands, and in fact, these are a number of different areas which are linked through the sea routes that flow through this area. And this is exactly the same when we start looking here. So the island Southeast Asia is like the Pacific. There's a huge number of ocean space. And this ocean space is occupied a lot by the sea peoples. And they have what I've talked about is areas that are linked by major sea routes, which make these areas almost like a very large area of functioning unity. So while we can say, oh, here is Thailand, here is Cambodia, and they have their own unit, this is the same thing when you think of the sea peoples. And so when we're talking about the sea peoples, the Orang Laut today, this area is also linked considerably by these sea routes that lead to relatives as well as to resources. And so this is important to remember because this is what made them very powerful. So this is the sea peoples that in their area of the sea. Now let's just take a quick look at who these sea peoples were in order to help you to situate them when we start talking about their linkages with the entrepot states, the Malay entrepot states. So the thing to remember is that the basic social economic unit was small, and they were under elders or a chosen leader, and they usually were they had their own titles. Oftentimes they were called Bati, which is a very local Orang Laut title. And so there were a number of these groups, but all these communities occupied strategic islands within the Nagara Salat. So it was not one monolithic group, but there was a large number of them throughout the region. And in the former kingdoms, they served as the navy and the coast guard of these entrepot Malay states because of their knowledge of their home waters and of the islands and what was connected there, and because of their participation in the sea trade, they had boats that were created for the conditions in the water, and they learned about the seas as a result of the search for sea products. And so here are just some of the images. You can see the images of on the left of the sea peoples in their communities on stilts in the sea, and they're joined, of course, by walkways, and they have their boats
Recording stopped.
Attached to the sea, and then here is just a modern area. So what one needs to understand is that the Orang Laut did not form a united kingdom. They were not monolithic. And the historical evidence demonstrates that they acted separately. And they had also differing loyalties within the Negara Salat. So some served Johor, others served Palembang, others served Perak, and so forth and so on. So they operated in specific waters, but they did cooperate. And this is what is very interesting, that when they were threatened or when they were looking for or to take advantage of the economic opportunities that arose, they tended to work together. They cooperated. And so you realize that they had different skills and they were in different parts of the Nagara Salat. And you can see that in the 19th century um, uh, account of what were the tasks of the Orang Lao. And there were a huge number of tasks. And there were different tasks, mainly because they operated from different areas of the Nagara Salat. But when necessary, they gathered together and they shared the sea products when there was more in one area than another. But they also were able to work together when they were threatened from the outside. And so they were a very efficient fighting force and were sought after as allies.
Recording in progress.
So with this background, then, we can easily see how the Orang Laut then became prominent in the history of the Malay archipelago states. So here we know that the value of the Orang Laut was as the Navy's primary Navy and Coast Guard patrolling the sea lanes for these landed kingdoms. But they were also important in the collecting of sea produce for the international trade, which were then brought to the Malay archipelago states to be sold to foreign traders. And one of the things that often people forget is if you look at the sources, both Malay sources or Dutch or other European sources and even Chinese sources, there is evidence that they were the ones who helped in the establishment of the site for the capital of these archipelago states. And why were they so keen? Why were they so keen in doing that? And what I suggested in some of the things that I've written is that the Sea peoples needed the Malay archipelago states as much as the Malay archipelago states needed them. Because what the Sea peoples needed was a place where they could sell the goods or the products of the sea that they were gathering. And so they were very keen on having a place where they had assured market. And so this is what the Malay archipelago states did. And so you can see in this Sejarah Malay, for example, that we know that Malacca was created as a result of the help of the Sea peoples. They showed the ruler where to go and where to establish the new capital. And here and there, I've shown you some pictures also of the differences of Sea peoples. We talk about Sea peoples and we tend to remember only what we know about them today, that they were small, unimportant groups in small little houseboats like here. But they don't talk about the large seafaring boats that were used during raids as well as for fighting. And so here you get an Ilanun warship from the southern Philippines. The Ilanun were a very prominent sea peoples, and we know about them in the Malay world because they raided as far down as the Malay Peninsula in order to be able to get what they needed, namely slaves, in order to work their economy. And so people used to talk about the Musim Lanun when they used to come down with the winds to move into the area. And this is on the right is a very interesting thing from Spain, where they looked at what they called the Malay pirate ship, and these were obviously Orang Laut ships, which were used as were the Malays. And this is where again it's very difficult to divide the Malays from the Orang Laut in many of these expeditions, because many of the crews were of mixed Malay as well as Sea peoples. So these were the ships that were used both by the Malays and the Orang Laut. So the first group that we do have some evidence for is the Srivijaya, which was created at the late 7th century into the 14th century. We know earlier that there were other groups that were starting to develop states along the Straits of Malacca, but we know too little about them. But we know that some of the sea peoples were also important in their establishment and in the functioning of these states. But the first real evidence we have is from the Srivijaya period from the 7th century. And what is interesting here is that the Srivijaya kingdom was further south from this area where the Nagara Salat was, or where the core of the Orang Laut were. But they did extend southward to include both Bangka here as well as Biliton here. And so this is where Srivijaya occurred, right in this area here, between the Batanghari River and the Musi River. So here is the Musi River, and Srivijaya was located initially inland, away from the coast, because the coast was very swampy, and so this is where they operated from. And similarly, when Srivijaya moved the capital to Jambi, they were also inland. And so one of the functions of the sea peoples was to establish themselves at the mouth of the Musi River here and the Batanghari River here in order to protect the Malay capital upriver. And so they established their base here and served really as an early warning system and also to prevent the movement of enemies upriver. And so they guided ships through the straits, but also were able to protect the Malay states themselves from attacks from the outside world. So they were very prominent in Srivijaya, the Orang Laut, in bringing goods to them, as I've mentioned before, sea produce, but also guiding ships into these areas, because many of them didn't know where the capital of Srivijaya was, because it was not on the coast. And so the sea peoples had to go bring the traders in and lead them into the straits, lead them into the capital. And what is interesting as well is the talking of, or the mention of Bintan as an important part of the Nagara Salat. So I've been talking about Srivijaya to the south, but a little later after Srivijaya, although I said 15th to 14th century, this was only a sort of a rump area that succeeded after the 13th century. But you find that the Nagara Salat had already a very important island, Bintan, and an Arab geographer talked in the 13th century of Bintan as a center where armed black pirates with poison arrows emerge, possessing armed warships, and they plunder people. And so this Bintan is where the center of the Nagara Salat was in the 13th century. And this was echoed by Marco Polo in 1294, who talked of Bintan as a trade center for spices and other goods. And Chinese sources in 1323 also talk about a mission that went from Bintan to China itself. And then even later on, you get the story in the Sejarah Melayu, or the Sulalatu Salatin, where the Queen of Bintan assists the Sri Buwana, who came from Palembang, in establishing himself in Singapore. That's a very well-known story in the Sejarah Melayu. And we also know in 19th century Johor that the Orang Suku Bintang was still the most prestigious Orang Laut group in Johor. So we know that Bintan in the 13th century succeeded Srivijaya as the important center of the Orang Laut world. But we know the most about the Orang Laut in Malacca or also in Johor. But in Malacca, they were very prominent in the kingdom, and they served again as the navy, guarding the shipping lanes, bringing products to trade at Malacca, and the Portuguese sources. So now we have not only Malay sources, but Portuguese sources talking about how the Orang Laut helped in selecting the site of Malacca. This is what I mentioned earlier. And they also talk about the Orang Laut as being very prominent people in the kingdom, that they all still had descendants of the Orang Laut who still served as Bendhanas and Laksamanas, two very important officials in the kingdom of Malacca in 1509. So here again is the prominence of the Orang Laut as part of the administration in the kingdom of Malacca. And when the Portuguese attacked Malacca in 1511, they were prominent in the defense of Malacca, and the Portuguese talked about how they had blowpipes and that their arrows were poisonous, and so as they touch blood, they kill, as they often did to many of our Portuguese in the taking of Malacca. And so here again, we see the importance of the sea peoples, the Orang Laut, in the armies or the navy of the Malacca entrepot states. And when Malacca fell, again, they mentioned earlier, they were summoned to gather the people, the Orang Laut, to accompany the refugee ruler so that he would be taken to his new capital. So here is a very important statement of the prominence of the Orang Laut right through Malacca. And here is a very nice illustration taken from the Portuguese in 1635. 1635, they were still in control of Malacca. And here is the Malacca River coming out to the straits. And this is where the center of the kingdom was before the Portuguese arrived. And this is where the Portuguese also put their major settlement as well as their administration. And here on the other side of the river is where the merchants were. And then here on the top, under the Malays, were where the Malay kampungs, where the Malay villages. And the Portuguese also used them then for their own purposes. And so we know a lot more of the role of the Orang Laut in 1530s into the late 19th century because of the convergence of a huge number of Dutch sources, Portuguese sources, as well as English sources, as well as Malay sources. And what we know is that they perform the same functions for Johor as in Malacca. And they were the ones who also led the ruler, the refugee ruler, to the site of the new capital on the Johor River. And as in Malacca, not as in Malacca, but as in Srivijaya, they also established themselves at the mouth of the river to protect the upriver capital from attacks from the sea. And in this area here, you get the mention of the important passageway through the narrow straits, the Pedra Ranca, the Middle Rock, and the South Ledge, which were the important movement, which are the important straits used by traders moving through from the South China Sea into the Straits of Malacca and backward again. So it was here then at the in Singapore that they established a customs and guard post. And here is a post in from the Portuguese material, which is I took um, from a study done earlier, which shows Singapore here with the Straits of Singapore here, and where the Shabandaria, which was the customs post that was located here, and then the presence then of the Orang Laut to serve really as a guard post for Johor, which was upriver. And so what we look at then is the demise of the Orang Laut in the Malay world. And one of the reasons is because of the conflict that occurred in the Malay Anthropo-state in Johor with the death of the Malay ruler Sultan Mahmud in 1699. It brought division in the Orang Laut. They had been working together, but then as a result of the death of the of the king, there was a movement of some of the Orang Laut to serve other rulers, and then you had the presence of the Bugis in Minangkabau, which then made it very difficult for the Orang Laut to carry on as they did before. And when the Bendahara dynasty took power in 1728, they were served mainly by the Bugis, and therefore many of the Orang Laut then left their service to Johor, and others served a different group then at those places. And so what you have then is changes in the position of the Orang Laut, but it was a combination of things. It was also by the 19th century, much of the economic function that they had been undermined because there were now new sources of revenue from new plantations and mining ventures that were being created in the 19th century, so that the Straits produce from the sea was not anymore as important as it was in the past. And so the role of the peoples was now undermined. And secondly, you had the introduction of the steamship and advances in the arms technology, which made the Orang Laut role as guardians of the sea lanes redundant, because now the steamships could move anywhere they wanted at any time of the year, and they were able then to undermine the very important role which the sea peoples had played in the past. And so you get a shift in the perceptions of the sea people. So even though in the beginning of the 18th century they were still considered the most important of Johor's fighting force, constituting a quarter of the fighting role, they were losing their vitality, so that by the middle of the 19th century, they had lost their social and economic importance as well as their strategic importance. And so what you find is now other things are more important. Mobility is downplayed, and instead people are talking about sedentarism. A fixed place of occupation and is more important. Landed kingdoms or landed economic pursuits are more important than maritime ones. And so the depiction of Orang Laut is now colored very seriously by the late 19th century perception of the Orang Laut as being unimportant and weak or groups of people. And so the depiction of the sea peoples is also affected. So this is from an middle of the 19th century depiction by a European, in which they portray the Selatars, the sea peoples of Singapore, in the state of undress, where the Malays here are totally clothed. And this is not simply um, uh, uh, a way in which they saw that. This was not what they saw all the time, because the sea peoples were as up to date with cosmopolitanism because of their long contact with the Malay anthropo states. And so in their formal dress, they would have been very indistinguishable from the Malays. But for the British and many of the others, they tended to see them in a state of undress as a way of depicting them as being a lot more savage than the more sedentary landed Malays. And so I end with this comment about the assessing of the Malays in the Negara Salat and the relationship to the Malay anthropo states. So what I started out to show you was that environmental factors enhance the value of the sea peoples in the Negara Salat to the Malay anthropo states because of the East-West trade, and so that I showed you in the beginning, and that the special skills of the sea peoples made them very effective as guardians of the sea lanes, as well as collectors of sea produce, and therefore they were seen to be very much sought after as allies by the Malay lords. And so you can see in the evidence from the Malay sources themselves how they were seen as allies. But by the late 19th century, they declined in value, and their whole sense of being, their identity, had been undermined. And so this is, unfortunately, what we now have of our memory of the sea peoples, of unimportant groups that are now no longer are as important as the landed kingdoms and no longer play a role in the Malay kingdoms today or the Malay states today. So I end with this thought that what is necessary is the need to go back and look at the historical evolution, the historical role of the sea peoples, and to restore them to their proper place in the history of the archipelago or the Indonesia, Southeast Asia, Singapore, and Malaysia. So I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Andaya, for bringing us into a very vast historical place, going back all the way to the early times, and actually trying to look at history and space, but from a different perspective, a different point of view, looking at the seas, at waters for now, and not the land or the fort or ruling polities, but rather from a very different perspective, where you look at the seascapes not as empty space, but rather filled with meanings once you look at it from the Orang Laut's perspective. So now I invite the audience to please put your questions or comments in the question and answer box, and not in the chat box, and we will look at them. And if you want to speak, can you please raise your hand, and we can call you so you may be able to speak. I'd want to ask some questions from the question and answer box. Father Antonio de Castro says, if Dr. Andaya is not able to cover the answer to this question, I would therefore hope in the open forum, what is the current situation of the Orang Laut in the areas of Southeast Asia where they are still to be found? I think, yes. Would you want to answer that briefly?
Sure. In a place like Malaysia, where they were the most prominent, They have basically disappeared, mainly because what the Malays have done have they've been put into the category of Orang Asli, which were an indigenous people from the interior, not Orang Laut. So the Orang Laut itself has no real identity there. In some other places, they've been incorporated in general indigenous groups, like in Indonesia, and so what you find is that their importance has been very much downplayed because they are not recognized as significant. And that's similarly also in the Philippines, when you do have a lot of them around, but they don't play as important role as they did in the past.
Another question here that was sent. Why was there so much loyalty from the Orang Laut to the Malay leaders or the Sultan?
Yes.
Aside from the economic aspect of things.
Well, the basic thing was economic. The fact was that they saw the value of having an important place where they could trade their goods. And one of the things, remember when I talked about the new book that came out, The Sea Nomads? One of the points they made was the emergence of the Sea Peoples as a special group in order to take advantage of the new economic opportunities that had arisen. And I find that very compelling, mainly because you can see that in the historical evidence, that these people did very quickly take to the Malay entrepôts. And you can find this evidence also in Eastern Indonesia, where you have the Bajau, the Sama Bajau, also assisting in the hold on a minute, please.
Yes, thank you. So while we're waiting for...
So anyway, so
okay.
Thank
you. That was quick.
Sorry, I had to do something. So basically what they did was also do exactly the same thing that the Orang Laut were doing in the western part of the archipelago. So economics seems to be the largest point.
Okay, before we go on to the next question, just to let everyone know, the book that was being mentioned, Sea Nomads of Southeast Asia, Peter Schoppert has posted for more information on the book that Professor Andaya has mentioned, and he looked at it at the NUS Press, and he provides the link. So thank you, Peter, for that. Now we go on to the next question. Doreen Fernandez is asking, so it sounds like the Orang Laut are not distinct ethnic or sub-linguistic groups, rather they are drawn from the surrounding communities by the economic opportunity?
Yes. So this is the theory that was advanced by this new book. And it seems to work because the rise of the Sea Peoples seems to be very connected to the new economic opportunities that arose from the East-West trade, and so this is that can be shown through sources. And what is interesting too, I was thinking about this, that what's happening today in some of the people, the Orang Laut people, is that they become Muslim. Or they were Muslim before, but what they've done is they become merged with the Malays. So some of them become indistinguishable from the Malays. And so if you think of them emerging out of a community from the coast, a literal community such as the Malays, what you're finding now is that once this economic opportunity is left, they've gone back to becoming Malay, and probably going into new types of occupations that are which are much more valuable economically.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. There's a raised hand. Jomo would want to make
Yeah.
a comment or ask a question. Jomo, you have the floor. You have been given access to speak.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Andaya. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. I'd like to ask, I have so many questions, frankly, but let me confine myself to one question, which relates to the theme of the exhibition, which Kajin and his colleagues have put.
Jomo, you have been muted. Jomo,
Yes.
we can't hear you.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Again,
okay.
please with your question.
I think I was upgraded or whatever that means. Let me resume the question.
Yeah.
Basically, I think we are reliant on a number of sources for a lot of our understanding of many of these issues, and some of them are contemporary. If we think of the Kanun Laut and what the Kanun Laut has to say about how Malacca was governed. And if we contrast that with, say, something like the Sejarah Melayu, which was really written about a century later, and it's the elements of legend as well as recall involved in writing the Sejarah Melayu. So, but dealing specifically with the question of the Orang Laut, I think the nub of what you have to say, the nub of the significance of the Orang Laut is basically their key role to me as a sort, not only as for navigational purposes through the straits, but also very crucially for the importance of Malacca is the role of the Orang Laut in serving like a coast guard, if you will, to use an American analogy of protecting people in this area. Where I have a bit more difficulty is discussing the whole range of people who live and are engaged with the sea as Orang Laut. I mean, there was a very nice drawing of a Ilanun warship, and of course we all know that the Bugis ships were actually not only more flexible in terms of navigation, but also faster, and they were most important allies of the Dutch in capturing Riau and so on and so forth. So, but going back to Malacca itself, it seems to me that the Kanun Laut gives us some idea of the importance of the Orang Laut and its Kanun and the relationship of the Kanun Laut, and I think you're absolutely correct about the reciprocity involved. In fact, looking at Apelli's work and as well as other works, there are a whole range of studies which suggest that part of the reason why such communities, which were subsequently dubbed pirate communities, actually survived so well was precisely because they were far more egalitarian compared to, say, the British West Indies Company and so on and so forth. So let me stop there because I have so many other questions for you, but that will have to wait for another time. Thank you so much.
Right.
Andaya.
Yes, I see your point. And one of the things that needs to be emphasized is that in these fleets, so you're right about the idea of Malays and Orang Laut, even in the east, in the Baja, the Bugis, for example. The Bugis, so-called Bugis, were actually a mixed group of Bajau, Bugis, Makassaris, and so forth. So that what you find is exactly the same thing. And when you talk about the Kanun Laut, the laws of the sea, one of the interesting things about this is that you get the creation of these Kanun Laut from the as you're saying, from the Malays, also working together with the sea people, the Orang Laut, has happened in Sulawesi. They also have a Bugis Kanun Laut, and they do also work together. It was the oral traditions as well as the written traditions. But one of my students who works on the Bajau has found actually a Makassarese document was written by the Sea Peoples, in which they have a lot of the kind of information that we talk about as part of the Bugis background. So it is correct. I think what we need to do is be much more flexible when we talk about who is going out to sea, because they were always a mixed community. And so the boats that were used would have been both maybe a Malay boat adapted or an Orang Laut boat adapted. So they were using whatever they needed to make them the most effective that they could. And it is true what you said, when the Bugis came into the region, they already had a long tradition of seafaring, and they had also very good boats. And so they were able then to take on the Sea Peoples very effectively, as we know in the Tupat Al-Nafis.
Okay. I know we're nearing the end, and there are so many other questions involved. But we'll just choose. I know you have something to another function to go to, but we'll just ask one or two more questions. Here we have Professor Leonard talked about loyalty to the leadership of Sultan Mahmud, but within the Orang Laut themselves, were they in history egalitarian, or they too had their own systems of power within the Sea of Islands?
Yes, they did have some type of leadership. So you did have someone like a Batin. So, but the Batin was oftentimes someone from a family. He's an elder. And so they did operate very much like a family. Because there were small units. And so you had a number of different families. So yes, you can probably call them egalitarian in that way. But once they combined for some major project, for example, when they went on expeditions to collect sea produce, oftentimes they had to have some type of hierarchy to govern the large number of ships that were going out. Or when they fought, there was a kind of hierarchy. But in the actual everyday functioning of the community, it was very egalitarian.
Thank you. Professor Andaya, I think Yongmi Kim asks a very specific question. Was there their own language or writing system or oral history from them? You mentioned the well should be here as far as 50,000 years, but the water level of sea in Southeast Asia became similar to present day 4,000 years ago. Where could we see evidence of them before that?
Yes, this is the only one is what evidence of them is suggestions made by the archaeologists about they would have been Sea Peoples, but not necessarily the Orang Laut that we know. And so this was a sea nomadic group that was participating in the movement of objects. So that's the only other thing. What was the other part of the question? I forgot.
Where could we see the evidence of them before that?
Yeah, that's the only evidence that we have of them before that. So that the kind of evidence we have is really fairly recent, in the last 2,000 years, really.
Oh, Noel, I think you're muted.
Okay, no, there's a whole list of other questions, and would you still have time to answer? It's already.
Yes, I have 10 minutes.
Good. Okay. I'm just going random through this because there's just a whole list. Thanks, this from Nazri Barawi. Thanks for this wonderful talk. Are there sources about the Orang Laut from their own narrative, traditions, such as myths, legends, folk tales? And if so, what do these suggest about how they understand their own history?
Yeah, this is very good. It's a very good question. Things have been collected, and so you can kind of look at some of the stories that are there. One of the things we lack is what was found for the Baja, where they actually wrote in Makassarese. I think that was what the question was before, but where did they have their own language and so forth? Yes, they did have their own language, but they were not all similar. And one of the linguists in that book, the Sea Nomads, has pointed out that many of the languages of the Orang Laut are related to Malay. And so this is the reason why there's kind of a belief that they had emerged from that group. But the other point that I was going to make is that what the Bajau did in Makassar is they borrowed the Makassarese script to write their stories. But from the stories, you realize that they did have a lot of knowledge. And I'm not sure how much of that knowledge has been preserved, because many of the stories that come out are kind of tales, and they're not kind of huge ideas about navigation or whatever. Whereas they do have stuff on navigation in the Bajau community. So my feeling is that they must have had all that, but in the subsequent period when they were not very prominent, a lot of this had been forgotten.
Thank you for that. To answer that question as well, may I call on the other project team leader of the exhibit, Lim Xiaoyun. Xiao, would you want to speak and answer this question live? Yes.
No, you can talk.
No, I think it's all good, Noel.
Okay. Pak Wan Ko asked, there are Orang Laut subgroups, the Biduana, Suku Gelam, Seletar. Other than location, what distinguishes them from each other? How is society organized? Is there any appointed leader within each Orang Laut?
Yes, many of them are referred to by the place where they are. Doesn't mean that that's what they call themselves, but this is what they're referred to. And they all, as I pointed out earlier, operate in smaller groups. So yes, you will find a large number of Orang Laut scattered around, or in the past they were scattered around, not very much anymore. But yes, they would have been small groups and different Orang Laut. So even in the historical period, after the 1699 in Johor, many of them split up and went to different kingdoms to serve other groups. So this can happen once the unity falls apart. And this was because of the conflict among the Orang Laut groups as to who was the rightful ruler that they should follow.
I think there is also a confusion because there are so many different groups. And so Ibrahim Ezaidin just asked, are the Orang Seletar the Orang Laut?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And then Beng Tan asked, in terms of religion, like burial customs, were the Orang Laut different from the more land-based Malays?
You know, the historical sources don't tell you much about that, but so much of it comes from really later anthropological studies. So we don't really know. My feeling is that they probably operated very much like the Malays who live on the coast. Because one of the things that seem to have been emphasized by anthropologists is that they do bury their dead on land. Not They don't dump them in the sea, and that is interesting itself. But I don't know.
Okay, I think related questions are by Prem Tom and Jinti. What role did hydrography play in replacing the inherited maritime knowledge and skills? And then with this, what did the Orang Laut's visual culture look like? Were there any motifs that were unique to them?
You know,
I think
that's again a very difficult question, mainly because the historical documents don't show much of that, and also when you're talking about the hydrography, that itself may have disappeared after the probably by the late 19th century, or from after the 19th century, once their function had ended, and because they hadn't had a written tradition. And they hadn't used the Malay script as far as I know, unless of course it appears somewhere in Malay in the Malay archives. But no one has come up with anything that's been written down which might tell you about this. But judging again from what the Bajaus did, they certainly knew a lot about the seas in which they were traveling, and so they also had all kinds of references about this and that. And in a much later study of Bugis navigation, many of those things were also mentioned in the 17th century source. So, you know, they would have had that knowledge.
Mhm.
But if it hadn't been written down, that would have been the end of it.
But with regards to the question on motifs that were unique to them,
Yeah.
we can look at the Sama Bajau, for example, all the way from the Sulu zone to down. You can see the mat weaving, which had precisely different types of designs. But I wonder whether the mat weaving designs were also parallel to those from the Riaulinga and others. But that's something where more research should be done when we give more space to the Orang Laut. Joshua asked, in some Chinese records that was mentioned that Malacca, it was mentioned that Malacca wasn't a kingdom, but the leader was the head of a fishing village. Would this be the Orang Laut, Orang Selat?
Yeah, the Orang Laut. Yeah, they would be head of the, so there was a fishing village at Malacca, and this would have been the Orang Laut village.
Okay, and
You know, they talk about the Orang Laut village, right? But again, they would have been a mixture probably, Orang Laut and Malay, because it's right on the coast.
Ramla Tibali asks, what role did the women folk play? Were the quote-unquote professional Orang Laut only men?
As far as I could see from the documents, they don't, it's not mentioned. We know from anthropology later on, of course, they did a lot of, they sailed together with the men. But I'm not sure they participated when they went on piratical expeditions, for example. I think they stayed back. And especially when they went for very long periods when they were searching for sea produce. I think many of the women stayed back to stay with the children and to gather food for them and so forth and so on. So they had a very important role of getting food. And so they were efficient that way. But in terms of the other kinds of functions, I don't see where they are mentioned. And unfortunately, many of the sources, like European sources, they don't put gender in when they talk about the Orang Laut, right? They talk about he all the time. So we're not sure whether some of this might have been women doing some of that work.
There's a question by Nelson Dino. Of course, the term Orang Laut is generic. But I'll go further down to his main question where he asked, Sama, a name, did they identify themselves as with a particular name? By a particular name?
That is what I was saying. I never found any reference among the Orang Laut to what they call themselves. So I don't know. So we know that the leader was called a Batin, but we don't have any. And the names that were given to them were given to them. So Orang Salatar, for example, they didn't name themselves that.
Yes. And
so I don't know what they call themselves. And even the term Orang Laut is interesting. I mean, I think the Sama Baja has a name because of the Filipinos. They had a Samal speaking group. They were very strong in the Philippines, in the Sulu archipelago. And so they used Baja or Samal Baja, so that you had a kind of large generic name for that group. And in the north, you also had a different group because they were from a different language group, Moken and Moklen.
Mm.
And so they had a particular way in which they referred to themselves, but not for the Orang Laut. I don't know if it would be great if somebody actually found evidence of, what they call themselves. We call ourselves this. Because in many of the cases, in early stages of any society, they call themselves people. So they might have called themselves sea people. But, I'm not sure.
So to answer other questions, maybe we can refer your book, Leaves of the Same Tree, Trade and Ethnicity in the Straits of Malacca, and the new book you mentioned, Sea Nomads of Southeast Asia. And James Warren's Sulu Zone is coming out with its 40th edition as well tomorrow. So, there are other materials now being launched and out there. There are other questions, but I think we don't have enough time right now. And so may I call on Karjin to give us further news on the next activity.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for attending. Thank you so much, Professor Andaya, for a wonderful talk. I think just a last sort of thought in my head is that I've seen this talk, I think, twice now. And I think what really struck me the first time I read this talk was, I was like, oh my God, I've been lied to in my history education. And I think mostly because, I think like Professor Andaya says that, in the histories that we learn, very much the Orang Laut are considered almost clients of Malay lords and kind of, almost like hired help, right? Like, oh, we got them to do this for us, right? And it portrays a very, very different kind of relationship, a different kind of network that's not bounded by sort of petty land geographies as well. And I remember the first time when I saw this and I heard about this, I thought to myself, given how important the Orang Laut were and how the roles that they played, and really that the Laksamanas were from there as well, and they played this such pivotal role in helping the refugee Sultan to Johor. How different would it be if we had learned this history in schools, and how different today would we view the role of indigenous peoples in Malaysia, right? So I think not only is it incredibly historically significant, but I think it has great socio-political significance in terms of how we view indigenous peoples. That being said, that's not the end of all these talks. We actually have another talk coming up that will be featuring on the 12th of November, also at 11 a.m., featuring Professor Shauna Kim Lowy Ball, who I'm not sure, but I think she's in this seminar. Oh, hello. Yes, and it will be yes. Oh, okay, Professor Shauna Kim. I've just promoted you to a panelist, so I'm wondering if you could give maybe say hi to everybody and give a sort of like short brief of what you might be talking about on the day. Oh, you're muted, I think.
Sure, yes. So I will be giving a talk on Malacca as not just the entrepot we know so well, the sort of rich, interconnected, maybe multinational entrepot, but thinking about its essential relationships in an expanded network. Where is the hinterland that feeds Malacca, for example? The rice is coming from largely Java, from a bunch of other places. Where are the products it is selling coming from? So to think of it as a dependent, much bigger state, but not an inland state, an overseas state. And perhaps state is putting it too strongly. So that will be the talk next time.
Yep. Thank you so much. I think Dr. Shauna Kim Loy Ball has also had like a very interesting sort of like look into the role of diversity in Malacca's entrepot, the role of kind of open trade and policies and different and the role of indeed bureaucracy and law in terms of accommodating different systems. So I think if you're interested in the history of Malacca, but also broadly, I think even those who are interested in what makes or breaks entrepot and its peoples, I think there'll be an incredibly fascinating talk. And after the talk by Professor Louis Ball, there will also be a response from Dr. K.S. Jomo, where he'll be sort of leading discussion, and also I think him as a sort of economist in Malaysia who's very, very interested in the kind of like colonial as well as pre-colonial economies. I think he'll have a very interesting response as well. So anyway, all of this is actually part of a huge exhibition that we're putting up called All the Lands Within the Seas, which is taken from a letter. It's a phrase taken from a letter written from Sultan Mansur Shah to the King of Ryukyu, which of course is present-day Okinawa. And really, it's our kind of expression of an attempt to decenter discussions of Malacca as this monolithic city-state kind of thing, where the world revolves around Malacca, but really to understand it as one of all the lands within the seas, as existing in what we've called today the Selat, and as well as the Sea of Islands, where it's had interconnected relationships, all these networks of trade, as well as a kind of global history that that even after colonization, right, the Portuguese, the Dutch, etc., connected it to a sort of cascading network of different peoples, companies, interests all over the world. So I highly encourage you, if you're in Malaysia, if you're in KL, please do come by. It's at the back room, which is Kampung Atap. I've put in the details here. And of course, please, we are also, have a virtual tour for those who can't make it. I'm not a professional historian, but I have tried my best to convey some of the stories behind the exhibit. And we also have a brochure, although really it's 13,000 words. So I don't know if I can call it a brochure anymore. An academic brochure, perhaps, in length. But it's a gallery guide with a guide to basically every single image. There are 87 images in total. I think it's going to be a very interesting experience. And I think the interesting thing as well is that we also have a narrative storytelling game where we try to encourage people to kind of see these connections, etc. And we will also be obviously sending all these materials to you, Professor Andaya, as well as Professor Louis Ball. So anyway, please do register for the talk that's going to happen on the 12th of November. And for everything else, you can visit our website at www.cloud.onl. It's all in the post that I just put on. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Professor Andaya, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you so much, Professor Andaya, for
Thank you.
being part of this and for contributing and taking time out of your very busy schedule. So on behalf of Cloud Projects Enterprise, the project team Lim Xiaoyon, Onkar Jin, and our intern Nisrina Aulia, and the featured artists Amanda Gale and Bam Hizal, I thank all of you for joining us today and see you all at our next event. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
You can stop recording now, Karjin.
Oh, yes,
and
yes.
Stop live.